How many of you have been to one of our colloquiums this year? How many social justice majors do I have in the room? Yeah! I'm going to trip on this. So, as part of the social justice and cultural studies major, I just want to make a quick announcement. So we have a new track. So let's see, we have a pre-law and policy track. How many of you are part of the pre-law and policy in the room? So if you're interested in social justice and interested in issues of mass incarceration or immigration law, that would be a great track to take. We also have an art for social change. Anyone in the room, art for social change? This art activism is artistic design to make a difference within society. We also have mediation, peace, and conflict resolution. We have many students who are going to go on to become masters of social work or make a difference in mediation and NGOs. Anyone in this track? Yay! Good. We have advanced cultural studies also. Often students are double majoring, thinking about both English or film and social justice, or going on to get a master's in education. Anyone in that track? Yay! Now this last track, I don't think we have anyone in it because it's just been created, but we're hopeful. It is the environmental justice track. If you're interested in environmental activism or becoming a lawyer, that's environmental law. Anyone interested in global climate change or environment? Yes, Jennifer, you're my new major. So I'll pass these out. This is a really easy double major to get because you can double count classes that are in your major and in the social justice major. So if anyone's interested, go ahead and take one of those. So it is with great pleasure to have Dr. Bailey here today. And she has done an amazing job with the last 3 years of classes. I know you're moving to a new adventure next year, but I just wanted to take this minute on behalf of all of the people here and thank you for the amazing classes and the work you've done and all that you've done to help build the major, to plan it, and to dream it. We just want you to know that you're very loved, and we are so excited to have you speak today.
Thank you. All right. It's too much. I don't process emotion like that, so gotta compartmentalize it, push it away. All right, so just kidding. I'll model healthy emotion for you. So. All right, I am gonna talk to you a little bit. This is gonna be very casual, so I did not expect quite this much of a turnout. It's gonna be pretty casual. I'm just gonna talk to you a little bit about what I've been doing. I'm finishing my current book project right now, which is very stressful, but it is called How the Streets Were Made. It has a super long subtitle I'm not gonna go into. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project, but I want to focus today on one chapter that's called The Secret of Selling the Negro, and you'll see why. But basically, it talks a lot about how consumerism itself was racialized and how this comes out of geographic segregation. So, first, can you see this kind of okay? I know the sun is there. All right. What are the streets? I do want to talk a little bit about that. I'm not obviously just talking about physical streets. And we might talk about the hood or the ghetto or different kind of words people use interchangeably. I like this term for a number of reasons, partially because Ta-Nehisi Coates, whom I'm assuming many of you have read, almost all of you, yes? Good. If you haven't, add that to your summer reading list. He does a really amazing job of kind of fleshing out and theorizing what the streets are, and I took that as kind of the point of departure for my project. So for me, I'm really spending my time in the book explaining how the streets are not just like a physical place or space, but this socio-cultural construct with its own set of kind of ideologies, of practices, opportunities, limitations, things like that. I have a quote that I think is really beautiful that explains it. It's not from Between the World and Me. I know that's what most of you probably read. Yeah? Anybody read The Beautiful Struggle? No? I highly recommend it, actually. It's I think it's his first. Yeah? It's his first. It's really good. This is from that book where he talks about, for him, this point of realizing, like, that something was different in growing up and what the streets were. It's a bottom quote where he says, "The streets were a country, and like all others, the streets had anthems, culture, and law," right? And I think that's kind of understood for people who either grow up in those spaces or for most Black Americans whose lives are kind of shaped by the understanding of those spaces. But for many people, understanding what the streets are is a little harder to place, right? There's another kind of part in We Were 8 Years in Power where he really gets into it and talks about the difficulty of naming the streets. It's not just about like geographic segregation. He says it's hard to, well, I'll just read it because he's much better with words than I am. Let me just, paraphrasing is not going to do it justice. "When I recalled the Baltimore of my youth, it did not seem to suffer from anything so quaint and simple as segregation or white supremacy, terms that conjured colored-only signs, night rides, and thuggish sheriffs with ominous nicknames. Instead, the box represented itself in an abundance of men hanging out on corners, single mothers working night shifts, teen parents in all my high school classes, and kids with ready and easy access to guns." So there's this thing that the streets are that you can't really point your finger at that kind of are birthed out of geographic segregation, right? But have kind of surpassed that alone. And that's what I spend most of my project really looking at. I'm not going to go into this because most of you know this history. If you don't, there are amazing resources. But if you don't know the history, how many of you have read or talked about in classes? I think Dr. Nessie does a class on this, right? On like housing segregation, geographic segregation. Anybody taken or read anything related to that? Just Darian and Drew, a couple. Yeah, I know you teach a class on that. That's true. You could take Dr. Hansen's classes. Okay, so maybe less of you than I anticipated. There's a really great PBS special, and you know I love PBS, called, what is it called? This part is called The House We Live In, but it's called Race, the Power of Illusion. That's what it is. There's a book, The Color of Law, by Richard Rothstein, which I know you teach on, and then American Apartheid. There's like some really good scholars that have already done all the work of explaining like, here's how we have all these policies from like federal policies that essentially subsidize home ownership for white Americans to more local policies like covenants and things like that that made it so that most of our geography is highly segregated, right? So this is how we came about where we get, urban city centers that are highly concentrated with Black Americans with high rates of poverty, low rates of home ownership, and then the creation of like white middle-class suburbia, right? In a nutshell, there's a long history of that. They also do some really good studies of how this wasn't just in these kind of legal and other means, but there were physical kind of acts of terror that helped secure these borders, right? So in Chicago, you all are familiar with the south side of Chicago. Yes, we all know culturally what that means. That was created and enforced by bombings, right? So there was like a bombing almost every month for a series of a couple of years to keep Black people out of these white neighborhoods, right? And this is part of the history we don't quite talk about. But all that to say that I spend some time on this in the book, but I want to turn to something that I think is less discussed and maybe equally, if not a little more interesting. And that's how home ownership, right, has shifted our perceptions of kind of American belonging and consumerism. So I love this because history, like you can't make up history. It's so great. I'm like, it gives you so much material that you couldn't make it up if I wanted to. So this is before we get to all the kind of official federal housing policies. So in 1919, we have the Own Your Own Home campaign that started. And what happens is you have in everywhere from like offices meant to kind of promote this amongst like middle class people to factories meant to get kind of working class folks. To school children, they had like buttons and pamphlets they would pass out. There's this massive campaign in the US to get people to buy homes, right? And to link it to American belonging. A lot of this comes out of a fear of communism. Because what happens in 1917? Anybody? Good, right? Everybody's quiet. The Russian Revolution, everyone's scared. They're like, we do not want communism here. We do not want a revolution. How do you get people to really invest in American capitalism? What's the greatest investment you can make here? Buy a home, yeah, property. So, and this was, I'm not just saying this is documents where they're like, people, an investment in a home is an investment in American capitalism, right? Can't make it up, it's wonderful. So, you have ads like this, where you have a man and his manhood, his ability to provide, his nuclear family, his citizenship are all tied to home ownership, right? I'm gonna show you this, in the pamphlet that this was in, there's this quote that comes next to it that's worth looking at. Sorry, history makes me laugh. So, it should be a matter of personal pride with you to own your own home. Pride in your proved ability to give your family a home of their own. Pride in the ownership of real property, an ownership that places you among the bigger men of your community. A homeowner is a marked man, marked in the letters that can't be missed. Success, right? Your family looks to you to give them a home of their own. They know that there is more happiness and comfort in a home of one's own. Let your children grow up in a real home atmosphere. Give your wife an opportunity to show you that she can be a businesswoman and a loving wife and mother at the same time. Own your own home, right? So this is how I try to convince people. So much is tied to the nuclear family, to your variability or sense of, identity as a heterosexual man in this country. And so this is the very beginning of kind of how we define home ownership in relationship to like class and whiteness and heterosexism. I'm going to show you one other ad because they're great. The images, I'm going to do a lot of images today because they're fun. So you see what's happened aiming towards the man, but there was also a lot of campaigns towards women. That's why they're mentioned at the bottom. So this is one saying, how glad I am that I agreed with him to get our own home, right? But there's, in the Delineator, which is this magazine that was aimed towards women, it becomes a whole kind of business where they market to women that owning a home means you can buy these, you can decorate, you can do this, you can become a homemaker, right? So this is the beginning of an industry where you are marketing certain goods to women along with it and redefining middle-class white womanhood. Actually, sorry if I'm making you dizzy, it's Prezi. So, this continues on. The problem with the Own Your Own Home campaign, and even with Hoover, this is in 1931. I'm going to read this address he gives because it really drives the point home. But what happens is, through the 20s and 30s, you get this movement. It isn't very successful because it's extremely difficult to actually purchase a home, right? So people are into it in terms of their identity, but what did it take to buy a home back then? Does anyone know? What does it take to buy a home now? True. It seems more difficult now, but down payment-wise, 20%. Yeah, maybe 5 to 20, depending on where you live in the country, what kind of loan you get. Back then, you needed like 50%, right? And you had to pay it off in like 7 years, right? So, can you imagine doing that now? Especially in Seattle, right? So it was like that for them. So people like the idea of it. They're like, yeah, I want to be a good American man. I want to be a housewife, but they couldn't afford it. This is why later on we get these policies that subsidize it and make it possible. And this is when this really takes off. But before then, you have people like Hoover and the Own Your Own Home campaign, the Better Homes in America movement, all laying the kind of cultural foundation. And I'm going to read this because, again, Hoover just like does the work for me. So I am confident that the sentiment for homeownership is so embedded in the American heart that millions of people who dwell in tenements, apartments, and rented rows of solid brick have the aspiration for wider opportunity and ownership of their homes. To possess one's own home is the hope and ambition of almost every individual in our country, whether he lives in a hotel, apartment, or tenement. This aspiration penetrates the heart of our national well-being. It makes for happier married life. It makes for better children. It makes for confidence and security. It makes for courage to meet the battle of life. It makes for better citizenship. There can be no fear for a democracy or self-government or for liberty or freedom from homeowners, no matter how humble they may be, right? I mean, you can't overstate how much they were invested in homeownership and securing kind of the American way of life, right? There's one other great example later on, after you get all these policies, where you do actually get most people living kind of the creation of white suburbia. After that, in the Cold War, the best moment that kind of encapsulates this, anybody know what I'm going to talk about? It's one of my favorite Soviet premieres.
Was it that debate about the
Good.
house? Yeah.
The kitchen debate. This is my favorite thing. Has anybody heard of this? Right? So, was it 49, I believe? Yeah? Cold War. I'm not going to get into all the details, but we had this cultural exchange. So then Soviet premier and then Vice President Nixon, they have this exchange where they go to each country and show the best of, like, here's what Soviet communism can do, here's what American capitalism can do. What did we include in our display? If you had to guess? a model home, right? And it's a $14,000 model home comparable to like Levittown, like the more famous, you know, very affordable, very accessible, again, for certain types of folks. And Nixon, they get into this debate, which if it's worth looking up online, it's on YouTube because Khrushchev is hilarious and they go back and forth and it's worth watching, but I'm not gonna play it right now. And Nixon really hits home, like, look at the conveniences that come along with home ownership, right? It's not just the physical home. There's, you know, the dishwasher, there's, you know, the washing machine, and he actually says, home ownership for us, he said, we want to make life easy for American housewives, right? And that's part of his selling point of like, this is why American capitalism is great. Khrushchev gets into it with him and it's like, this is what's wrong with America, you're sexist. And they go back and forth. But again, the idea that for us, American identity is so rooted in questions of gender, of class, of race. And this creates an industry, right? So we have like Tide and Cascade, some of those detergents that now are kind of ubiquitous in like American households. This is where we start to have the trend of those first being invented and then being marketed, right? So you kind of can think of the things that come to mind with like home goods. The question then is, where does that leave Black Americans, right? Because they have been essentially, if the small margin of percentage, completely disenfranchised from this movement of home ownership and belonging, right? So if you create this new economy around home ownership, home goods, and then an identity of like, this is what it means to be a good citizen, a good American, a patriot, where does this leave Black Americans, right? And this is what I spend a good part of my chapter looking at. So part of what happens, I'm gonna come back to this and play this clip because it's gold, but is there's a long history of kind of underdevelopment of both Black commerce and Black consumerism, partially because you had segregated markets, right? So Black people could only sell to other Black people. You can't compete in the mainstream market for a long time. And then finally, when they can, things have developed so disproportionately that you can't compete economically with these large kind of conglomerates owned by white businessmen. So that's one issue. And because of that history, even amongst both white and Black Americans, Black business goods are seen as inferior, right? So everybody's shopping. Drake and Caton did this really great study back in the 40s called Black Metropolis, where they look at Chicago and they surveyed and talked to people. A lot of the Black Americans just see their own kind of businesses as being shoddy or inferior, right? So it's hard for Black, you know, business owners to even compete in this market. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is how that shapes then the perceptions of Black consumers and what they're looking for and what kinds of things they buy. So for most of the early, I'm gonna play this minute actually. For most of the early 20th century, nobody's trying to market anything to Black Americans. You get a few things and they're like not geared towards us, and they have like mammies and sambos and very kind of racist caricatures. It's not till increased urbanization, right? And you have all these Black people living in the city, they're like, oh, wait a minute, they have some money to spend. Let's figure out how we can make this work, right? So this is what happens. And in 1954, John Johnson, who owns Johnson Publishing, that did Ebony magazine, which I'll talk about in a little bit, who just recently filed for bankruptcy. I'm like, complicated, especially when you're trying to get permissions. But anyway, you know Ebony magazine, yes? Okay, so John Johnson, really in a lot of ways, he spent most of his life trying to carve out a space for Black consumers to be recognized and to kind of highlight the well-to-do Black Americans. There's some complicated things going on there that I'm not going to get into. But he partners with the U.S. Department of Commerce to create this film, and it is called, I'm not making this up, The Secret of Selling the Negro. All right? And I'm like, they couldn't have anticipated the irony of that, but it's great when you're writing about stuff, right? The Secret of Selling the Negro. I'm like, come on, slavery was not that long ago. You should know that was not a good title. But this is essentially a like how-to instruction for white business owners to say, look at how much money they have. This is how you can sell to them, right? So all of a sudden, Black people are getting noticed, but then when they do, and what I look at in this chapter is, what kinds of things are marketed and how does that shape our perceptions of Black people and through their consumer habits. I'm going to play just a minute and a half of this. It's great. That's all I can say.
$15 billion every year, and after taxes, Negro families still have many billions of dollars to spend. Here is a buying power that cannot help but have a tremendous effect on our national economy and on business prosperity in general. When these dollars are spent for a wide range of goods, services, and employment, business everywhere is bound to feel the impact.
This new buying power has resulted in a class Negro market, a profitable, above-average income group of consumers. For example, the nation's largest newspaper and magazine research organization, Daniel Starch and staff,
Sorry for the
reports
static.
these significant figures. More than 51% of the readers of Ebony magazine have a record player in their homes. Almost 64% own a television set. And almost 78% enjoy the convenience of an electric refrigerator. It is also a fact, and this is from the magazine The Food Field Reporter, that Negroes spend almost $3 billion a year for food alone. Per capita, they buy more cosmetics, drugs, and toiletries than anyone else in the country. And their children are better educated too, because since 1930, enrollment in Negro colleges is up 2,500%.
Okay, I have to stop it there. So, anything that stands out to you? I told you to be slightly interactive. What kinds of things are they saying they'll buy? What do we notice? Anything stand out to you? Good, cosmetics, are we going to say? Yeah.
There seems to be emphasizing things that would typically be bought by like housewives and like women with like
Yeah.
cosmetics and like the woman grocery shop.
Yeah, cosmetics, food, that kind of stuff, record players, entertainment, that kind of stuff. Good. Also, you love the fact at the end of like, look, what it pays 2,500%, right? Maybe because something happened in history where people could finally go to school. But there's like no reference of that in the film, right? It's like magically they're educated and they can spend money, and it's like, but this is I'm not making it up. This is how the conversation and the discourse was going, right? This is again why history is great. Like you don't even have to dig deep. So you get all of these new things published in kind of the dominant advertising and marketing like journals. So an advertising agent sponsor were like the things circulating that marketing people read. And you get articles titled things like food and clothing get most of Negroes $10 billion, right? And then this person in the second one was trying to make an argument about like the impact of segregation. But what they end on, so they say like, oh, you know, we take for granted that they can't go to certain places and do the same things as us. But because of this, the Negro will spend much more money on food, clothing, appliances, automobiles, and other items. Negro standards of living in many categories of goods are a match for white standards. But you'll notice what types of things, right? So if you haven't seen the trend already, what becomes associated with black consumerisms are kind of the fading things of food, of clothing, cosmetics, not things tied to financial savviness, ownership, kind of investment, right? And we saw earlier on with Hoover and the Own Your Own Home, that's all about an investment and a real lasting stake in America, right? In contrast, the things that are marketed to black Americans are like, oh, entertainment, food, how you look, those kind of flashy things that will pass. You can maybe see where I'm going with that. So, and this is my last little section, and then I'll open it for questions in a little bit. I have a few more things to show you, but just so you know. I went through, Ebony magazine has all their archives online through Google, which is great, but it's a lot. Issues were long, okay? So they would be on average like 150 to 220 pages, right? I found when I went through and averaged it about 185 pages in each issue, about 75% of those were advertisements. So it's primarily, Ebony was about marketing to black people, right? It's the flagship kind of magazine. John Johnson, the same one who did that film, created this to be kind of the black version of Life magazine, right? So it's this like lifestyle magazine. I went through, I'm not going to go through all the details, and I did some comparative kind of looks at what was advertised and kind of the prominence or how often things were advertised. And so what I found is that in contrast to white counterparts, or what's shown in like the similar magazines aimed at white Americans, black Americans were disproportionately targeted for things like clothes, cosmetics, often like skin whiteners, right, and hair straighteners, those kind of cosmetics that work towards assimilation. And then things like accessories, cars, musical instruments and things related to entertainment, right? And if you know certain historical stereotypes, some of this should be, you know, seeming familiar, right? There's also a great variance in quality. So in the mainstream kind of white American magazines, you'll have luxury and imported cars very often marketed. Not the case in Ebony. It's primarily, you know, Ford, Chevy. You do get some Cadillacs in there, which is a separate thing that I won't have time to get into. But on average, there were 3 times as many ads for home goods, right? So there were very few home goods often, and for the early kind of magazines, there were almost none. And then when you do get them, and I'll show you in this next slide, they were primarily things like furniture, things that have nothing to do with ownership, but that feel like ownership, at least when you're marketing them, right? So I'm going to show you, this is not a good, it doesn't show up well here, so I'll show it on this. This is from Bassett Furniture, and they were one of the few consistent home good ads in Ebony magazine, and eventually they have the black kind of models depicted in here. If you look closely, you'll notice, where are they living? Can you see it all? Does this look like a house? No. What do you see in the window there? Yeah, they're high up. It's an apartment building. So it's interesting that it's almost a little self-aware of like, oh, home goods, buy this fancy furniture. It feels kind of luxurious, right? At least in what you see there, but not tied in any way, shape, or form to things like ownership. And this is kind of the trend I saw. The few things you would see would be like, you know, an appliance possibly, but mostly like a vacuum cleaner or something for your kitchen or furniture, things that are in close proximity to home ownership, but actually not related to ownership itself. What you see in things like Life magazine were things about renovating, putting in new like sinks and bathtubs, things that were very clearly tied to ownership, right? So there is quite a difference or a contrast in the types of home goods that were marketed. Okay, this is where I have to see if I hit this, is it going to start over? Okay, good. So the other thing I noticed about Ebony is this kind of contradiction of, they were very aware of some of these issues. They even had, for example, next to this, they had a special issue on the white problem in America. That's what they called it. If you know the history, most of the time, racism was called the Negro problem. So they were trying to subvert that. And it was a really good issue. They even had a couple of articles dedicated explicitly to geographic segregation and like, you know, issues of home ownership. So they're very aware of what's going on. This was directly across from one of those. You have like a large half-page ad for UltraWave that is meant to help you straighten and smooth down your hair and assimilate better, right? This one over here is a separate issue they had celebrating the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So you can imagine what's in there, like, look how far we come, but look how far we have yet to go. It's very critical, great articles, including one on black women and like what they've had to deal with, where they're at in the world. No joke. Across from the article on the black woman today, you have this ad over here, which is for a whitening cream. So it's interesting that on one hand, you have these magazines trying to talk about these social issues, but what's being marketed to black people is reinforcing these things of assimilation and of perishable goods. So to wrap kind of up, and then I'll open it to see if you have any questions. Essentially what I found in my research is that on one hand in the US in the kind of early to late 20th century, homeownership related to a very specific cultivation of white consumerism is tied to like an investment in the country and in American capitalism, right? In contrast, black consumerism was highly racialized as in goods that are flashy, all about appearance, right? Not really investing or making financially savvy decisions. And this continues to shade perceptions of blackness today, especially black urban belonging, right? I mean, I don't probably have to come up with examples for you to think where you see in dominant discourse the idea that people who live in the hood, like, they just don't work hard enough to pull themselves up. They just want to buy clothes and cars and fancy things, right? So we have these dominant ideologies, but what I wanted to get at was how they are the direct product of geographic segregation and then the marketing that resulted from that. So that's my research and chapter in a nutshell. I don't know if you want to come up or questions, otherwise I'll let you enjoy your afternoon. Anything?
I have one question.
Yeah.
So first of all, this is really an outlet for them to read. Is there a way, was your research pointed to the ways that oftentimes these consumer marketing also have underlying financial systems that further in debt? So you get your furniture, but you have to take a credit, right?
To do that, yeah. I don't talk a lot about that, but I point to it a little bit, more so in the chapter when I do the economic part in the first chapter with like predatory lending and those things. It's definitely an extension of that. But you're right, in the ads they often have, I'm sorry, I have a weird sense of humor. But like they have like, you want to buy this fancy thing, here's how you can sign up and pay over, how many years of your life, and not even then really own it, right? So I don't go into it a lot in the actual chapter, but that's a really excellent point that maybe I might have to add a footnote in my revision. Anybody else? Yeah.
I feel like we've talked about like the problems with the FHA before, and their continual kind of like desegregation with like the differences in like school districts and all that stuff. Is your research pointed towards like the idea of like a kind of abolishment of the FHA, or kind of a distribution of that, or like what
That's a great question.
Like what do you suggest?
I remember you also in class being like, so what solutions? You always have great questions on that. So actually, because of that class and some of the feedback I got from you all, in my conclusion, I spend a lot of time talking about like what can you do and what possible like redress is there. Thankfully, again, if we just like didn't ignore history, I didn't have to come up with most of this myself. In 1968, the Kerner Commission put out this book-length report that was essentially, they were tasked with explaining race riots like what happened in Watts in the late 1960s. Surprisingly, it's this bipartisan thing put together with business people and politicians. Pleasantly surprised that they go through and say, oh, the problem is that we've had these policies of geographic segregation and we've made all these people poor and living in concentrated areas. So here's the solution. You need to spend your money to fix this. You need to have job programs. And they kind of list out all these possible solutions. So a lot of it, honestly, is that. And I put that in there. It's not cheap. Reparations never are. But the longer you wait, the more expensive they get. So at some point, you just got to kind of bite the bullet and do it. Yeah. Or not. And then who knows what's going to happen. But that's the short answer. Yeah. Anybody else?
When is your book going to be?
It's a great question. As my colleagues will tell you, academic book publishing takes forever. So I'm turning in the final version at the end of the month. I'm very stressed about that. But it'll probably be at least another year because you have to take like copy editing takes forever, right? It's like out of your hands. My part will be done, but then it gets lost in the world of like academic presses taking forever to do whatever they do over there. I don't know. But yeah, but hopefully next year. And I will be sure to pass on the information. Yeah.
Is there something specific that kind of got you started thinking about this, or has it been a long time coming that you've been developing?
It's a great question. I think it's a weird answer. One is a long time of like, part of it is growing up in spaces where like I'm very aware of how I myself am racialized, and as someone who didn't actively grow up in the streets, it still shaped my life. So I talk about this in my intro a little bit. Like my mom grew up in the projects, didn't want that to be quite my story. So like we moved almost every year because we didn't have money. In order to not have to live in those spaces, she just had to move to wherever she could find cheap and accessible housing, and to keep me in schools where I could have a chance to do well. So that was just our reality, is like to avoid the streets, we had to like displace ourselves every year. So that was something that I was kind of aware of, and her stories about North Minneapolis. But also for me, and this is why I have a chapter on hip hop, listening to hip hop and hearing people talk about the streets and what they really are, and realizing that many people don't get that it's not just like this cool thing you say when you're like, oh, streets. Like, that was one thing that I was like, let me explain what this is and where it comes from. So it was also hip hop and personal experience, yeah. Old school hip hop, I'm realizing. The most contemporary thing I have in there is Kendrick Lamar, but yeah. Anybody else? No? Oh, sorry. Way back there, yes.
Hey, how would you speak to Black American literature wrestling with patterns of consumerism and homeownership over the span of history that you're talking about?
Like, how are they wrestling with it, or how would I talk about people consuming their work, I guess?
Either. Both.
So I have another chapter on, so this is what I do, because this is cultural studies. For all you future, cultural studies folk, is I have one on the kind of history and economic and social implications, that chapter, and then I get into consumerism, and then I have a chapter on literature, hip hop, television, and film. If you're not familiar with hood genre films, there's a whole thing. John Singleton recently passed away. If you don't know who he is, his body of work was really important. But the chapter on literature, what I love about that and what you see in Ann Petrie, who was recently, I think, put in the American Library of Congress. She's amazing. If you get a chance to read The Street, it's an amazing novel. It's from 1946, I believe. But on one hand, while I'm talking about kind of the negative impact of things, what I try to spend time in these other chapters is that the people inhabiting the space both speak to kind of those issues as well as the way they renegotiate their belonging and their community in them. So it's not all this negative thing. People find ways to live and resist. And so a lot of that takes place primarily in literature. So I look at Ann Petrie and James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates and how they're kind of theorizing existence within those spaces. Read Ann Petrie. She's so brilliant. I never get to teach her because it's a long novel, but I highly recommend it. It's also interesting, a fun, you know my sense of enjoyable, but it's a good book to read. That's what I'll say. Ann Petrie, The Street. I think that might be it. No? Okay, I think we need to wrap up. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you a billion times for what you've done for our community and the teaching and the research and all that you've done. In my church, we have a tradition when you take new steps towards a new journey is we give a candle to light your way. So on behalf of Dr. Bantam and myself, the social justice majors, the English majors, and everyone in the school who have been touched and changed by you, may this light your way.
Thank you. That's so sweet. Thank you. All right, well, I think that's it.
That's it. Thank you.